Hey there, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to dive headfirst into a topic that's generating a lot of heat lately. Immigration. You've sent us a stack of articles and research about the potential economic fallout if, the new administration's aggressive stance on immigration, becomes reality. Buckle up, because this is a deep dive with some serious ripple effects.
That's right. Yeah, we're going beyond the headlines and we're exploring the potential consequences, particularly the economic impact on businesses, prices, and even your everyday life.
Okay, so let's unpack this.
Yeah.
We're talking about a scenario where things escalate beyond stricter policies.
Yeah.
We're looking at what could happen if there's a full-on hunt for immigrants, both legal and undocumented.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is how deeply intertwined immigration is with various sectors of the U.S. economy. The sources you've shared paint a complex picture with potential impacts on everything, from GDP and labor markets to housing and even grocery prices.
Okay, so let's start with the big picture. The
Yeah.
potential hit to the U.S. GDP. The research paints a pretty alarming picture.
Right. It does. Yeah, some estimates predict a reduction of anywhere from 2.6% to 7.4% by 2028. To put that in perspective, the Great Recession saw 4.3% shrinkage.
So we're potentially talking about an economic downturn that could be even more severe than what we experienced during the recession. And this is all tied to a crackdown on immigration.
That's what the research suggests.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a combination of factors, but labor shortages are a major concern. We often hear about the reliance on immigrant labor in agriculture and construction, but it goes way beyond that. The source material highlights just how many industries rely on immigrants. Think service industries, hospitality, even professional services.
So what happens when those positions go unfilled? Do wages just go up as businesses compete for workers?
Yeah.
Or is it more complicated than that?
It's definitely more complicated. Yeah, while some workers might see wage increases, there's also a real risk of wages being suppressed in certain sectors.
Right.
Think about it. If workers are afraid to speak up or assert their rights because of their immigration status, it creates a breeding ground for unfair labor practices.
That makes sense. It's not just about the numbers of workers, but also the power dynamics at play. So fewer workers could actually drive some wages down. Seems counterintuitive.
It is. And beyond the impact on labor, there's also the loss of tax revenue to consider. The research points out that undocumented immigrants contributed an estimated $96.7 billion in taxes in 2022 alone. If those individuals are deported, that's a massive chunk of change that vanishes from government coffers.
Okay, so less tax revenue and fewer people working means less money flowing through the economy overall. What does that mean for businesses and ultimately for consumers like you?
Well, fewer people in the country translates to less demand for goods and services. Businesses across the board are likely to feel the pinch. We could see a decline in consumer spending, which would further dampen economic growth.
And what about the cost of living? Would this scenario push prices up even higher? We're already seeing inflation squeezing budgets. How would this play into that?
It would likely make things worse. Take housing, for example. We already have an affordability crisis, and this could exacerbate it. Think about construction labor. If there are fewer workers available, building costs are likely to rise, making homes even less attainable.
So it's a potential domino effect hitting everything from our wallets to the availability of basic necessities like housing. And we haven't even touched on the impact on specific sectors like agriculture, which the research seems to highlight as particularly vulnerable, right?
Absolutely. Agriculture is heavily reliant on immigrant labor, especially for tasks like harvesting crops. A significant reduction in the workforce could disrupt the entire food supply chain. We're talking potential shortages and price hikes on the things you buy at the grocery store every week.
So that avocado toast you love could become a luxury item.
It's not out of the realm of possibility. And remember, it's not just about the price of individual items. Disruptions in the food supply chain can have far-reaching consequences, impacting the availability and affordability of food for everyone, especially low-income families.
That's a sobering thought. And this is all tied to the potential consequences of increased aggression toward immigrants.
That's right. The research suggests that a more aggressive approach to immigration enforcement, particularly if it leads to large-scale deportations, could have a ripple effect across the entire U.S. economy.
Okay, so we've got a potential GDP hit, labor shortages, loss of tax revenue, rising prices, a lot to digest here. But before we move on, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about the potential for wages being suppressed in certain sectors. Can you elaborate on that a bit more? What does that look like in practice?
Imagine a scenario where workers are afraid to speak up about unsafe working conditions or wage theft because they fear being reported to immigration authorities.
So even if they're legally allowed to work here, the fear of deportation could prevent them from asserting their rights.
Exactly. And that creates an environment where employers can exploit workers more easily, potentially driving down wages and working conditions for everyone in that sector, not just immigrants.
So it's not just about the direct impact on immigrants themselves. It's about the potential for a broader erosion of labor standards.
It's a complex issue with far-reaching implications. And the sources you've shared really highlight the potential for unintended consequences.
Okay, so we've been talking about these potential economic impacts in a general sense, but the research also delves into the specifics, right? What are some of the key findings that really jumped out at you?
One of the things that struck me was the sheer scale of potential job losses. One study estimated that deporting all undocumented immigrants would reduce the U.S. labor force by about 6.4%.
Over 6%. That's a massive number. And where would those losses be concentrated? Is it just agriculture and construction?
It's not just those industries, although they would definitely be hit hard. The research actually breaks it down by industry, and the impacts are surprisingly widespread. Even sectors like professional services and manufacturing would see significant job losses.
So it's not just about low-skilled jobs. We're talking about a potential brain drain across various sectors of the economy. What are the long-term implications of that?
Well, the sources suggest that this kind of workforce reduction could have lasting consequences for innovation and productivity. It's not just about filling existing jobs, it's about the potential for future growth and development that could be stifled.
And it's not just about the workers who are deported, right? There's also the ripple effect on families and communities.
Absolutely. The research highlights the devastating impact that deportations can have on mixed status families, where some members are U.S. citizens and others are undocumented. Separating families not only causes immense emotional distress, but can also plunge those families into poverty.
So it's not just an economic issue. We're talking about a potential humanitarian crisis as well.
Yeah.
And the research touches on another disturbing possibility: increased racial profiling and discrimination, right?
Yes, that's a significant concern.
Yeah.
Imagine a scenario where people are afraid to leave their homes or interact with law enforcement because they fear being targeted based on their appearance or perceived immigration status.
That's a chilling thought. It sounds like it could create a climate of fear and mistrust that would be incredibly damaging to the social fabric of our country.
Exactly. And that climate of fear could have its own set of economic consequences. When people are afraid to go out and spend money, it can dampen consumer spending and slow down economic activity.
So like a vicious cycle. Fear leads to economic decline, which in turn can fuel more fear and resentment.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that these are not just theoretical possibilities. These are potential consequences that have been documented in other countries that have implemented harsh immigration policies.
So there's historical precedent for this kind of economic and social damage. What can we learn from those examples?
The sources cite several examples of countries that have experienced negative consequences after implementing restrictive immigration policies. For example, one study found that a crackdown on undocumented immigrants in Arizona led to a decline in the state's agricultural output and a loss of jobs.
So it's not just a hypothetical risk.
Yeah.
There's real-world evidence to support these concerns. And it's a reminder that we're all interconnected. Policies that target one group can have far-reaching impacts on society as a whole.
Exactly. And the sources also emphasize that these policies often fail to achieve their stated goals. For example, one study found that increased border enforcement did not significantly reduce undocumented immigration, but did lead to an increase in the cost of smuggling people across the border.
So it's not just about the economic and social costs, but also about the effectiveness of these policies. Are they actually achieving what they're supposed to?
That's a key question. And the research suggests that in many cases, these policies are counterproductive. They may create the illusion of action, but they don't actually address the root causes of immigration or effectively manage the flow of people across borders.
So if these policies are so costly and ineffective, why are they being proposed and implemented? What's driving this push for harsher enforcement?
That's a complex question with no easy answers. The sources point to a number of factors, including political opportunism, fear-mongering, and a lack of understanding about the complex realities of immigration.
It sounds like there's a real disconnect between the rhetoric surrounding immigration and the actual evidence on the ground.
That's a common theme in the research. The sources highlight the need for more informed and nuanced discussions about immigration policy, ones that are grounded in data and evidence rather than fear and prejudice.
Well, hopefully this deep dive is a step in that direction. We're trying to cut through the noise and get to the heart of the matter, exploring the potential consequences of these policies in a way that's both informative and engaging for you.
I think that's crucial. These are complex issues, but they're not insurmountable. By shining a light on the potential costs and consequences, we can hopefully encourage policymakers and the public to think more critically about the choices we make as a society.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential economic and social impacts of a more aggressive approach to immigration enforcement,
Hmm.
but the research also delves into the fiscal costs, right? What's a price tag for these kinds of policies? How would this affect taxpayers like you?
The numbers are staggering. One study estimated that the cost of deporting all undocumented immigrants from the U.S. could be as high as $285 billion over 5 years.
Wow, that's more than the entire annual budget of some federal agencies. Where does that money go?
A lot of it would go towards enforcement and detention. Think about the cost of hiring more Border Patrol agents, building more detention facilities, and processing all those deportations. It's a massive logistical undertaking that would require a significant investment of resources.
And what about the lost tax revenue we talked about earlier? Wouldn't that further strain government budgets?
Absolutely. When you remove millions of people from the workforce, you're also removing their contributions to the tax base. That means less money for schools, roads, healthcare, and other essential services that benefit everyone.
So it's a double whammy. Increased costs on one side and decreased revenue on the other.
Precisely. And the research suggests that these fiscal costs would likely outweigh any potential economic benefits from reduced immigration.
So from a purely economic standpoint, it just doesn't make sense.
That's the conclusion of many economists who have studied this issue. The costs simply outweigh the benefits, even if you ignore the significant human and social costs we've already discussed.
It's a stark reminder that policy decisions often have unintended consequences, and that it's important to carefully weigh the costs and benefits before making major changes that could impact you.
Absolutely. And it's also a reminder that we need to be wary of simplistic solutions to complex problems. Immigration is a multifaceted issue that requires thoughtful and nuanced approaches, not knee-jerk reactions based on fear or political expediency.
We spent a lot of time talking about the potential downsides of stricter immigration policies, especially the economic fallout. But I'm curious, in all of the research you've looked at, is there anything that highlights the positive impacts? Is there another side to this story?
There are definitely arguments made for reducing immigration. Some research suggests that limiting the influx of workers could lead to higher wages for certain segments of native-born workers.
So the idea is that less competition for jobs could benefit those who are already here.
Exactly. However, it's important to note that these potential benefits are often overstated and would likely only impact a small portion of the workforce.
And even for those workers, are there potential downsides that might offset those benefits?
Absolutely. Even if some workers see a bump in their paychecks, they'd still feel the broader effects of a weakened economy. Think rising prices for basic necessities, potential cuts to social services, and slower overall economic growth. It's not a simple equation.
It sounds like there's a real danger of focusing on a small piece of the puzzle and missing the bigger picture. We need to think about the overall health of the economy and how these policies could affect everyone, not just a select few.
That's a crucial point. Yeah, it's not just about individual winners and losers. We need to consider the collective impact on society as a whole.
Okay, so we've talked about the economic side of things in detail, but there's another aspect we haven't fully explored, the human cost. What are the potential social and cultural implications of these policies? How would increased aggression towards immigrants affect the fabric of our society?
That's a critical question. And the research points to a real risk of creating a climate of fear and mistrust, not just among immigrant communities, but within society at large.
Imagine a scenario where people are constantly looking over their shoulder, afraid to go out in public, or hesitant to interact with their neighbors for fear of being reported or targeted.
Exactly. That kind of atmosphere can erode social cohesion and undermine the very fabric of our communities. And let's not forget the devastating impact on families, especially mixed status families where some members are citizens and others are not.
The potential for families being torn apart is a heartbreaking consequence that we can't ignore.
And beyond the immediate human cost, there's the potential for long-term social and cultural damage. If we create a society where people are afraid to express their culture or live openly, we all lose out on the richness and diversity that make our country so unique.
It's a reminder that diversity is a strength, not a weakness. When we embrace different perspectives and experiences, we all benefit.
I completely agree. It's through the exchange of ideas, traditions, and ways of life that we learn from each other, grow as a society, and create a more vibrant and dynamic culture. Limiting immigration would stifle that vital exchange and ultimately make us all poorer both culturally and economically.
That's a powerful message. So where do we go from here? We've unpacked a lot of information about the potential consequences of stricter immigration policies, both in terms of the economic impact and the social and human costs. What's the key takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about?
I think the most important thing is to be aware of the complexities of this issue. There are no easy answers, and the potential consequences are far-reaching. We need to move beyond the sound bites and engage in thoughtful, informed discussions about how to manage immigration in a way that benefits everyone.
I couldn't agree more. We need to hold our policymakers accountable, demand evidence-based solutions, and ensure that our policies reflect our values as a nation. And for you listening, the next time you hear someone talking about immigration, I hope this deep dive has equipped you to engage in a more informed and nuanced conversation. Think critically, ask questions, and consider the full spectrum of potential consequences.
Well said. The choices we make today will shape the kind of society we want to live in tomorrow. Let's make sure those choices are based on facts, compassion, and a vision for a future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of immigration. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic to explore. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.